Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
So today we're really pleased to welcome along Morag Edwards. Morag spent over 32 years as an educational psychologist. Under the author name Isabel Ross, Morag uses her knowledge of child development to provide psychological insight into her personal experience at a co-ed boarding school. Her memoir, Almost Boys, The Psychology of Co-ed Boarding in the 1960s, was published in January 2024. Morag also writes historical fiction and contemporary domestic suspense under the author name Isabel Ross. She has an MA in creative writing from the University of Manchester Centre for New Writing. Really pleased you could join us today, Morag. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Hello, Morag. It's very nice to meet you. Thanks a lot for coming along today.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Naomi.
Morag, we've had several guests on who've written books about boarding schools. Why do you think there was a need to write one from a female perspective?
Well, when I was thinking about my own story, which didn't really happen until lockdown, when I decided to reread my diaries, which I had written at school, certainly from my last 3 years at the school. I then started to, I became very interested in the psychology of boarding, and I started to read around the literature. Everything that I could get my hands on, I read. And there did seem to be a predominance of the male boarder story. And although there were girls' accounts, they tended to be from all girls' schools. So there was very little from the co-ed boarding experience. But I didn't want it to be a straightforward memoir. I wanted it to be, I wanted to use my psychology and my psychological insights, where that was what jumped out at me when I read my own accounts as a 14-year-old, 15-year-old. And that was the book I wanted to write.
Thank you. So very much came from your own personal experience.
Very much so, yes.
So how old were you when you first went to a boarding school, and what was it like to be sent away?
I was sent when I was 10. It wasn't planned that I should go. I don't think that my family had really made up their mind about boarding school, although my father was an ex-boarder. But when you read Almost Boys, and I won't go into it now, I was in a very difficult situation at my state primary school. And so it was very much a last minute rescue decision by my parents. And so I went with very, very little notice and didn't really know, if I'm honest, what a boarding school was. And my parents, they weren't the kind of parents who would have been aware of a child having much in the way of emotional need or development, and they just got on with the practicalities. It was just before Christmas, 1965. The shops closed, if you remember, in those days. You probably don't remember, but between Christmas and New Year, the shops closed. And so we had to get a uniform and all the kit and a trunk and get everything organized. And I had sort of literally ended up there. And I think when you say what it was like, it obviously changed over time. But my first experience, I think, was actually one of complete shock. And I think I became very frozen for quite some time, highly anxious, but I hid that under a doing well mask. And I certainly know that I didn't cry, and was very much praised for being, the kind of girl we like who doesn't cry. And I think I just went round for my first couple of terms in an absolute fog, not really knowing, um, where I was and what sort of place this was. But also I was incredibly aware that the awful situation at home had stopped. And so there was that relief as well. But I knew fairly early on, particularly I was in a small girls' boarding house when I started. So I spent 2 terms there before it closed down. And by the end of my second term there, I knew that I wasn't in a safe place. There had been a couple of things that had happened to me already, which made me know that I wasn't safe in this environment. And in my final term, we were left with absolutely minimal adult supervision. And my friend and I, who were 11, got ourselves into quite a bit of difficult situation with some older boys, completely unknown well, there wasn't any staff in the boarding house, if I'm honest, and the kinds of things that my mother and father would simply have not allowed.
Gosh, so how many other girls were there at the time?
In that boarding house, there were 2 boarding houses at that time, and there would have been about 10 of us in the first boarding house I was in, but it hadn't been explained to my parents that that boarding house was closing. And so by the time I started in the equivalent of first year, year 7, I was in a boarding house of, it would have been probably between 40 and 50, I can't quite remember, but there was only one boarding house and there was about 40 to 50 girls. And so I went back after my first summer holiday to that environment. There were 800 pupils in the school, of which 400 would have been day pupils, and half of those would have been girls. So if you had spoken to any of the staff at the time, they would have said to you, oh no, we're 50-50 boys and girls. But actually in a school of 800, there were 40 girl boarders.
Right, so it was very much an imbalance, and presumably it was when the house became mixed. That is, there were
the house was never mixed. We were always boys and girls were always in separate boarding houses, but we mixed at school. There was a very, very big school with the boarding houses spread around the town. So the houses were never mixed, and they're still not.
So what were the areas that began to feel unsafe for you?
The school had all the usual rigidity about bells and gongs and being where you should be and being up at school on time and being in lessons on time and all of that. It wasn't flexible about that at all, and very petty rules and punishments for not adhering to those rules. But the adults, and I'm not sure why, but they had a complete lack of supervision in terms of our personal relationships. And we were in a small village, almost a town, the school very, very dominant in that community, with huge areas of beautiful Scottish countryside, but children just do not care about views and scenery, do they? We were far more interested in the fact that there were secret places we could go, and as long as you stuck to the rules, you could be completely unsupervised for hours and hours in our free time. And one of the things that I've read about other boarding schools is how they keep the boarders so busy. Well, that's not true with us. If you didn't play sport, and other than maybe choir practice or a music lesson that was once a week, after school and all weekend other than church, and being there for lunch and tea, your time was your own. And so, at 10, 11 years old, if you have a female child of 10, 11 years old, a mother will ask, where are you going? Who are you going with? Tell me again where you're going. And that 16 boy you're going out with, I'm not very happy with, you're only 12. Are you sure you should be going out with a 16-year-old boy? Oh, well, all right, if you must, but look, bring him home and meet him here. That's what a mother would do. But that was just completely absent. And I don't understand why they just turned a blind eye.
That's really quite shocking, Morag, isn't it?
It is. When you look back, it is quite shocking. I don't know whether they were just incredibly naive, whether they thought, oh, well, they're in a healthy environment, boys and girls going out for nice country walks together. What's wrong with that? I really don't know. And also, it wasn't just the opportunity for sexual exploitation, and also consensual sexual relationships, I have to say, that very, very common. Because of the lack of supervision, there were industrial levels of rule breaking in terms of smoking, drinking, not being where you should be. And there is a definite, in my peer group now, who are in their 60s and 70s, long-term serious health problems, and unfortunately a lot of early deaths from alcohol and smoking related conditions. But as I got older in the school and the supervision in the girls' boarding house became incredibly lax in my last 2 years, we were heading off to Glasgow and Edinburgh on our own, and nobody knew where we were. My mother would have been horrified if she'd found out that at 16 I was spending all day in Glasgow with nobody knowing where I was. That wasn't what they were expecting. So
I think you're incredibly charitable, attributing that to naivety, because I think surely anyone who knows teenagers and working with teenagers would, and that seems at odds with some of the ideas that were around previously, assumptions about girls and their vulnerability, certainly sexually, if not in other ways. So yeah, I suppose it just really smacks of a lack of care for the people that you're being charged with, and a recklessness of what would happen to your well-being.
I think it's neglect. Looking back, I think it would class as neglect. The complete failure to supervise the emotional well-being of boys and girls that you are in loco parentis for.
So how did you cope with it, Morag? Did you just go with the flow?
There were ways of coping. Some of the girls were incredibly sensible, and I have huge respect for them, that they just finished their lessons at the end of the day. They may have gone to hockey practice or music practice, and they went straight back to the boarding house, and there they stayed. And at weekends as well, because they had some sort of instinct about self-preservation, I think. And again, I think that was not what their parents were paying for. Their parents were paying for them to be having a rich experience. But they didn't. They hid in the boarding houses. But I wanted to be, I suppose by the time I was 12 or 13, I wanted to be one of the popular girls. I wanted to be out there. And that meant popular with the boys, because we didn't care about being popular with each other. we were in competition for the boys, and the boys were in competition for us. So I became one of the girls who was tried to be liked by the boys, which meant becoming a boy in a sense, in attitude. So I would laugh with their misogynistic comments, their cruel remarks about other girls, and I would try to make myself as as sexually attractive as possible, while at the same time not being a tart or a whore, which was a label that was applied to any girl who, well, there was no reason for it at all. You could find yourself labeled in that way. Reason at all, really. So it was all an incredible juggling act. I was hugely anxious all the time underneath. I had this bubbling anxiety, which would suddenly break out into very odd behaviors, where I would do absolutely reckless and stupid things. But if you had seen me there, or if I had filled out an attachment questionnaire at the time, I would have considered to be one of the girls who was thriving, because that was my survival personality that I took on to survive in this place.
Thank you. That's a very powerful portrait you've painted there, Morag, and we've spoken to a number of people who have been describing abusive situations in boarding schools. Mostly they've been describing situations where adults have been abusive towards them. You seem to be describing something much more akin to anarchy, really. There are certain films that come to mind.
Yes, exactly. When I went to see If, I think I was in my sixth form at school, and I just thought this was, I completely recognized the environment. Peer-on-peer sexual abuse is very well known in boarding schools. Alex Renton's book, Stiff Upper Lip, Nick Duffel, they describe peer-on-peer sexual abuse. and this was in boys' schools. Small boys fied, given names, passed around, the senior boys and the prefects used, and I think that a lot of public schools, independent boarding schools, decided in the 70s to bring in girls, not for the benefit of the girls, I hasten to add, but to rescue the boys. Now, I think that we were part of that culture, which is well known in boarding establishments, where peer-on-peer sexual abuse is perhaps more rife, but considered to be less serious perhaps than adult child sexual abuse. But it still goes on in schools, peer-on-peer sexual abuse. There are two reports I quote in Almost Boy from the last decade, which show that even in mainstream state schools, peer-on-peer sexual abuse is a real problem. And ICSA in the 90s found that, I've actually got the statistic here if I can find it, 25% of all reports to ICSA were peer-on-peer sexual abuse. So yeah, it's it's endemic, and in boarding school culture. Whether it still is, I don't know, but it still is in mainstream state schools. So I don't see why anything should be different in current boarding schools. And I think that it's something that schools need to be incredibly aware of and incredibly interventionist with. I think there's no point in sitting back and saying, oh, this is just boys and girls, this is how they are. You know, it is something that needs to be worked on from a very early age, from nursery onwards, if we're not going to have this as a real problem for girls and women in society.
So it sounds as if you're describing something which is a very common phenomenon rather than something localized to Scotland, for example, where you were.
No, I don't think it's localized to Scotland. I think the only difference was that Scottish independent boarding schools have, by and large, always had girls. And a lot of what is written about girls coming into boarding schools in the 1970s is not true in Scotland. That's a very English-centric view. Scottish schools, boarding schools, have always had girls, and so you would hope that they would be better at it than their colleagues south of the border, but I don't think so. I have no knowledge that it is any better now.
Really sorry to hear you describing your experiences, Morag, because just that sense of an absence of parental figures there, and I had wondered, to what degree there were any female role models available to you during your school days. But as you're talking, it sounds like there weren't role models there for either parent, really, aside from the teaching during the course of the school day.
Yes. Well, certainly not in the women who cared for us. And I do write about, in Almost Boys, about women and men with unregulated tempers, which was a common occurrence, I think, in schools in the 1960s and 70s. And we had that. In my second boarding house, into at 11, the matron, who's in the key caring role, she had an absolutely unregulated temper, and you just didn't know where and when it was going to come, whether you would be the victim of it or not. And it was often very shaming about our bodies and whether we smelt, or whether our periods had caused us to have a little accident into your pants or whatever, very shaming about women's bodies, girls' bodies. And she had particular girls who were real victims, and that, absolutely abusive to those girls. And those girls were picked up by other girls to bully, because in a sense we'd been given a free pass by this matron to bully those particular girls. And then the house mistress, who was the person who was the most in charge in the house, the senior woman in the house, she taught French in the school, and she was also the female head of school. There was a male head of school and there was a female head of school. So she was in charge of all the girls when she was at school. And she was very cold, very sarcastic, never ever kind. And she was actually abusive to me one day, where it was in prep and I had very, very bad acne under my fringe, and she got hold of my head and she grabbed my fringe and she pulled my head right back in front of everyone, and she said, and what is this? with the most disgust in her voice. And, that's an abusive act. So that's what she was like. And then in the school itself, all the teachers were male, apart from her and the domestic science teacher, only Mrs. on the staff. Of course, yeah, yeah. So no, there weren't any female role models. My mother was a female role model in that she worked, which was very unusual in the 1960s. She worked full time. She was deputy head of a huge comp in Northampton. And so I did get a little bit of a pass, I think, sometimes from the house mistress and from the matron, because they were scared of my mother. And they were also a bit scared of my big sister, who had joined me by that time. And as well as comparing me unfavorably to her all the time, they were also a little bit scared that my sister might report back to my mother that, our treatment was not what it should be. So I don't think I was as badly off as some of the other girls.
But it sounds relative, I guess, and
it's all relative, isn't it? Yeah. In an abusive environment, I was less abused than
and
others.
I thought you raised another question when you were talking then as well. So I think one of the things that I really struggle with is there's something really heartbreaking about thinking about sending kids away to, young children away to boarding school, especially kind of like those below the teenage years. And I think, well, what kind of individual can tolerate to be in that environment and see young children separated from their parents every day, and must see the homesickness and the vulnerability, and do kind of wonder, can you be a fully rounded teacher working in that person teaching and working in that kind of environment? And without wishing to sound too judgmental, I kind of think maybe not. So how can you then nurture, provide the nurturance that children need?
Yes, I think that it's one of the things I discuss in Almost Boys, is about how women did end up in these institutions, without any interest or care about the children that they were, paid to look after. But I do hold a particular anger, I think, inside me about the teachers up at school, because they saw us through the day. Half of the children they taught were boarders, but they did not show any inkling or interest in the boarders' lives, and keep you back after school and just ask you, is everything all right in the boarding house? I'm here if ever you want to talk to me. It was as if all the children were the same, and they didn't seem to have understood that half the children went home to parents and the other half didn't. And I just think, how could you not? And yet in Charles Spencer's book, A Very Private School, I also think that about the teachers, that the teachers would have known what was going on. They must have seen children who were badly bruised, who were, who came back from a caning bleeding, and they did nothing. I do find that quite hard to understand.
So, what was it actually like at that moment in the afternoon when all the non-boarders went home?
Well, we went back to our boarding house. They went back to their homes. And one of the things I do remember, and I write about in Almost Boys, that in my first year of secondary school, year 7, I used to stand on the steps of this huge, great big school. I used to stand on the Palladian steps, and I used to actually watch the day girls going home. And it was just a kind of sadness there, a real sadness watching going home, just imagining what they were going into. And we went back to very sterile environment, nowhere comfy to sit. You sat at the tables where you did your prep, your homework after school, which was your relaxation time. And you might read a comic or eat some sweets or something like that. But one of the things that I also think is neglect is that the girls were not given any food after school. Whereas I know that the boys used to run back to their boarding houses for bread and jam and a cup of thing like that. But we were not given any food after school until 5 o'clock tea time. And school ended at 3:30. And there was a very odd system where some girls' parents had accounts with the local shops. So those girls would go in and buy themselves a packet of biscuits or a yogurt or something on their parents' account. And they would take it back to the boarding house and eat it. And for those of us whose parents didn't have an account in the local shops, there was this strange situation where some of you had something to eat and some of you didn't until 5 o'clock. And I can totally understand that there wasn't a culture of sharing, because if they'd started sharing, they would have been buying biscuits every single night for those who didn't have accounts. And so they used to kind of sit like this and starting their homework, but they'd be trying to eat a biscuit. No one could see. And you just think, how bizarre is that? And how could the girls not be fed after school, and the boys were? I've checked that out with a few of my peers, and they say, no, you're right, that's an accurate memory.
Wow, it's almost unbelievable. But yeah, how do you think your experience has affected your identity as a woman, Morag?
Probably I'd say beyond measure, but I probably don't want to go into too many details about that. But yes, I'd say absolutely and forever. And I think that I was in a massive rush to get out of it and to become a mother. Because to me, being a mother was something entirely separate from this confusing world of male-female relationships and how to be attractive without being a tart and so on. And I thought, if I can get myself a family and be a mother, that's it sorted. And I got out of the world of relationships with men other than a husband as quickly as I possibly could. So I married at 20, I was a mother by 25, had 3 children. So that was my solution.
And how did getting sent away to boarding school shape how you were as a mother?
Again, absolutely fundamentally. But I think what hurts the most is it becomes clearer and clearer with hindsight. In the moment you're just living, you are being the best mother you can be, but without any real insight or understanding. And it's only as I've learned more and more through being a psychologist myself, learning certainly in the 90s as it hit all of us, about attachment and trauma and the importance of early relationships, and then starting to read around people who'd been at boarding school, their accounts of Joy Chauvet and how it might affect being a mother. Then it hits you, oh my goodness, I wasn't a good mother because of boarding school and I didn't know it. And so you then have to carry that. You've then got to live with that. And it's too late. Your children are grown up. You can't go back. All you can do is try and be the best grandmother you can be, and mother to adult children. There's no other solution. So yes, yeah, profound.
That must be a horrible burden to carry, though. That sense of, looking back and the realization.
Yes, yes, and it's hard not to. I know it's not my fault, but it's very hard not to blame yourself.
So you became an educational psychologist, which probably wasn't a total coincidence. And you've mentioned becoming a mother, and are you suggesting really that these and other events in your life follow on from your experiences in a boarding school?
I think I didn't plan to be an educational psychologist when I left school, but once I started on the path, I thought that it was a very good fit for me. The only thing I lacked was empathy. I left school without any empathy, or with very poorly developed empathy. And I think being a mother and being a psychologist sorted that out fast. I developed empathy normally and in a big way, in my early 20s. Thank goodness. And I also have to say that the clients, the families I work with, taught me everything. Listening to them, trying to support them, trying to support schools struggling with the most difficult problems, that was as important for my development as I was for them. So yeah, I did try to be the best I could be as an educational psychologist, with the typical boarding school pressure of trying to be the best all the time, and letting go of that was difficult.
Yes. Of course, developing empathy doesn't come through reading a book. So I suppose what you're describing really is being immersed in the experiences of being a mother, of meeting with the people you were working with, gave you the opportunity to create some form of release in your internal world.
Yes, I think it allowed me to up and develop emotionally fully. And if I hadn't done the work that I chose, perhaps if I'd gone to be something like an accountant or something, that might never have happened to me. So I'm incredibly grateful for the career path that I chose, and my wonderful colleagues and the supervision I had, recognizing how awkward I was to supervise at times, being a typical ex-boarder, but also learning.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that, Morag, in terms of being difficult to supervise?
Not being comfortable with any failure, not being able to ask for advice, being too independent. I can sort all this out for myself, leave me alone. No, I don't want to talk about my casework, it's all fine. And if anything went wrong, and I'm very lucky that not a lot went wrong, but when you're working with other people's lives, things do go wrong, and they can go wrong quite badly. I had no inner resources or resilience to deal with it. I went to pieces. But luckily, with fantastic supervision, I was supported through those one or two occasions.
That's really interesting though, Maura, because I think there's a real humility about you, and also, you know, as you reflect back, you can really hear a sense of taking responsibility, or, you know, holding yourself accountable, in a way that I think is really, really courageous. I think it takes a lot of bravery to do that, and I suppose that, you know, to me that symbolises resilience, that you have been able to do that. And maybe you're arguing a case for earned resilience, but certainly it, you know, it's hard to view you as somebody who's been rigid and not been able to, you know, it would have been quite easy to just continue probably and block out information that wasn't welcome, but you have taken it on board.
Yes, I think that I think I probably would acknowledge that I'm lucky that I have resilience, for all sorts of reasons, you know, being female, being quite verbally articulate, being a good listener, um, learning to deal with shame, I think, is really helps resilience, because um, one of the things that doesn't happen in a boarding school is the rupture and repair cycle. That's removed from you entirely, because you don't have relationships with adults where that will happen. And so you grow up without it. So you grow up with no resilience for shame, for understanding that if something goes wrong, it can go right, actually, with help. You know, there's nothing, almost nothing short of murder that can't be put right with the right approach. And so I think that just gradually, I think being around other mothers was great for me, learning to respect and like women, the way we talked about things between each other, then the families I work with, the training I had, the papers and journals and books I had to read, and the supervision I had, they all, you know, did that for me. And also learning to supervise others. And I do believe, you know, I'll put my hand up and say that the feedback I got was that I was a good supervisor. And so if you're telling other people, okay, look, you know, we can sort this, you feel really bad about it, and I can understand that, but look, this is what we can do, we can sort it. You know, the key thing is to learn from this. You have to believe that yourself if you're telling someone else, because otherwise it'll come across as fake. So I think I learned to self-talk myself through these things, become my own internal caring parent. And I have to say, was helped, but I have to be honest here, 3 years of very deep psychotherapy was crucial in becoming my own very forgiving, you know, internally supportive parent.
It really sounds more like that process of kind of recovering from, you know, recognizing how you'd been hurt and what impact that was having, and finding ways to address it. It sounds like that was invaluable within your chosen career as educational psychologist.
Very much so, yeah. And I think I got as much out of it personally as I gave.
I wondered how educational psychology changed over the course of your career, because as a psychologist, because at one point I did think about doing educational psychology, and so as a psychologist of seeing as an outsider, it looks like it's changed quite a lot over the course of the 30 years you were practicing. Is that right? And how has it changed, if so?
I think when I started, the there was, I mean, there always have been in educational psychology, because you work for a local authority. You know, you're a council employee, and you have to meet the targets that have been set for you. So even when I started, educational psychologists would have complained that we had far too many schools to cover, that we had way too many children to see, that the waiting lists were too long, we had too many reports to write, because writing the report was that was the shop window of your work, and if you didn't do it, you were carpeted basically. So that's always been there. But I would say from about the mid-90s to about 2010, something like that, it was, I think, the best time, and I was very lucky to be through it, because we had psychologists, very influential psychologists like Tommy Mackey, writing about how educational psychologists are mental health experts in schools. We should use them for interventions, for therapy. And we all got trained on trauma, on attachment, on the importance of relationships and relationship-based education. And we took that with us into schools. So we were doing huge amounts of training in schools, for school staffs for whom this was new. And then also, I think Sure Start was just wonderful, because I was an early years specialist, and working with multi-agency teams in Sure Start, where you are all working with the same families and children, it just creates a culture where all these barriers and silos are broken down, and you know each other, and you know each other well, and you can ring each other up and, what do you think about this? And we trained in Solihull approach, we trained in baby room, all of these very sensitive intervention programs for schools, parents, nurseries, and that was so fantastic and enjoyable and rewarding, although there was still always a queue of children to be seen in the reports. But I think what's happened now, talking to colleagues, is that the number of educational psychologists has gone down and down and down. Local authorities can no longer afford to have patch-based psychologists, so you don't have a kind of patch of schools anymore that you know well. And I do think that people aren't seeing the link. You've taken away the educational psychologists, and SEN rates are skyrocketing. And I would say, well, yes, of course, because you didn't know how much we were managing. Us and the school, we were managing together. And the school could rely on seeing us every fortnight, every month, talking over children, tinkering with interventions, and then saying, oh, now I think this isn't going well. I think we need to move this one forward now for EHC, because we've tried so much. And we were doing that day in, day out in schools. But for cash-strapped local authorities, it was impossible to quantify, what are you doing? And the salaries we earned were so much higher than other people's. And, well, you're not value for money, and all of those arguments. And when I was principal psychologist, which I left in 2015, I was told quite flatly, actually, we don't need educational psychologists here. We just need a principal psychologist, and we can buy locums in to do the reports, because that's all you do anyway, isn't it? And so now I believe that the number of EHCs outstanding is huge, and educational psychologists are, just being told, get those done, that's up from you. And I think so much has been lost.
I think that's part of the problem with any role where you're doing a good job that actually prevents deterioration and prevents, further input further down the line, because people don't notice that stuff, do they? So when you see incidents happening, then people want to put in place something to mop up afterwards, but they're less able to see the value. I don't think it's just educational psychology. I think you see that in other sectors as well, that it's almost like if you do the job too well, people don't realise what the problem was that led to the role being there in the first place, which is a shame, because it sounds like you really enjoyed doing the work you were doing and could feel the value of it.
Definitely. I think it's very hard to explain to people who don't have enough budget why you're valuable. It was very, very tough as a principal psychologist to argue that case.
Yeah. So, David, did you want to ask the final question? Because I feel like I've hogged Morag.
Of course, yes. I was just absorbed by your last answer, really, because it's so frustrating and eroding of the confidence of groups of professionals when they find themselves undervalued in that way, and they can see a service deteriorate before them. But anyway, Morag.
Sorry, actually, it's just reminded me of we had a conversation with a former probation officer, Rob Canton, and actually there's a lot of resonance in how you're talking, that sense of the really important work not being valued. So then what the role that the probation officers end up doing is actually the bit that's not so much of value, but it's easy to count, and so becomes more highly prized for that element, but leads to a much less satisfying job to do, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So anyway, Morag, it sounds as if writing has been really cathartic for you. What other ways would you encourage listeners to look after their well-being?
Well, I think I've been very lucky because I write professionally, and so I'm able to, I use everything in my writing that I know about children and child development, whether it's historical fiction or whether it's domestic suspense or memoir, whatever. But I think that writing helps everybody. I think whether it's journaling or whether it's actually formally narrative therapy, I think it allows a distance and to see patterns and to see what's happening, and for stuck situations to be recognized for what they are. And so I'd recommend everyone to write, even if you're just keeping a diary, and think about your emotions, try and think about what happened, what you're feeling, and so on. And if you can get a bit of help with it, so much the better if you're showing it to somebody. But I also think that in a closed institution, I think that whether it's the army, a prison, or a boarding school, trying to hold on to yourself, because all of these places have a culture and ethos, and you can become that. And while everybody does have to become that to a degree in order to fit in, it's not the whole of you. And so if you can hold on to part of yourself, and I think you can do that through finding time to be alone. And I know that's very hard in busy environments, but I think that earphones and listening to music or listening to an audio book, reading's not for everybody, but listening to an audio book, just gives you that privacy, that time on your own, and people can see you're listening to something and they won't interrupt you. Because I think that stories read well, you can have 20 opportunities a day to hear about somebody's relationship or somebody's behavior, and it's not you, it's somebody else. So there's no shame, because it's not somebody saying to you, why did you do that? It's, well, why did this character in this book do it? And so it's like you get the opportunity to experience, 10, 15, 20 times a day if you're listening to books. So that's what I would recommend.
It's a lovely answer.
Thank you. That's a tremendous illustration. Thanks very much indeed, Morag.
Thank you. That was really thoughtful conversation, Morag. Thank you.
Good. Thank you.